Tonight, I want to take you on a journey to a place where craftsmanship meets something far more unsettling than we could ever imagine. This story comes from the quiet coastal city of Kanazawa in Japan, where tradition runs as deep as the mountain rivers and artisans still practice techniques passed down through generations. Before we begin, I want to warn you that tonight's tale doesn't follow the usual path you might expect. There are no sudden scares or dramatic moments that will make you jump from your seat. Instead, this is a story that creeps into your mind slowly, like morning mist rolling over still water. It's about loss, memory, and the dangerous territory we enter when grief refuses to let go of the living. Our story centers around a man named Sota, a dollmaker whose hands possessed a gift that bordered on the miraculous. At 44 years old, he had spent his entire adult life perfecting an art that most people today have forgotten exists. His workshop sat tucked between narrow streets in the old quarter of Kanazawa, where tourists would occasionally wander in, drawn by the delicate porcelain faces that stared out from behind dusty glass windows. Sota learned his craft from his father, just as his father had learned from his grandfather before him. The family workshop had been creating dolls for over a century, each generation adding their own subtle improvements to techniques that were already considered masterful. But Sota possessed something his ancestors never had. Clients would often remark that his dolls seemed almost alive, as if they might draw breath at any moment or blink their painted eyes when no one was watching. The secret, Sota believed, lay not just in the precision of his carving or the delicate application of paint, but in the patience he brought to each creation. He would spend weeks studying photographs, memorizing every curve of a face, every subtle expression. When mothers commissioned dolls to resemble their daughters, or elderly couples wanted miniature versions of themselves, Sota would capture not just their appearance, but something deeper, something that made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. His workshop was a maze of wooden shelves lined with hundreds of porcelain faces in various stages of completion. Some had eyes but no lips, others had been painted with rosy cheeks but lacked the final details that would bring them to life. The air always smelled of wood shavings and the faint chemical tang of paint, mixed with something sweeter that visitors could never identify, but somehow made them think of flowers left too long in still water. 3 years ago, everything changed. Aiko, his wife of 15 years, passed away suddenly from an illness that the doctors couldn't diagnose quickly enough to treat. She had been the one who greeted customers, who kept the books, who would hum old songs while organizing the completed dolls in their display cases. After her death, the workshop fell into a silence so complete that even the street noise seemed to avoid drifting through the windows. Sota tried to continue working at first, but his hands, once so steady and sure, began to shake. The faces he carved looked wrong somehow, as if missing some essential element he could no longer access. Customers stopped coming, not because word had spread about his declining skill, but because the atmosphere in the shop had become heavy and oppressive. Children who had once pressed their faces against the window display now hurried past without looking, clinging to their parents' hands. Eventually, Sota stopped taking new commissions altogether. He would spend his days moving through the workshop like a ghost, straightening tools that were already perfectly arranged, dusting shelves that held no new dust. At night, he would sit in the small apartment above the shop, surrounded by the hundreds of unfinished faces that watched him from the shadows with their blank, expectant stares. The workshop became a place frozen in time. The calendar on the wall still showed the month Aiko died. Her coffee cup remained on the small table where she used to sit and handle correspondence, a ring stain permanently marking the wood beneath it. Sometimes in the late evening hours, Sota would catch himself listening for the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor above, or waiting for her voice to call down, asking if he wanted tea. His neighbors, all of whom had known the family for decades, began to worry. They would see him through the workshop window, standing motionless among his creations for hours at a time. The local shopkeeper mentioned that Sota rarely bought food anymore. and when he did appear, his clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame, and his eyes had developed the hollow look of someone who wasn't sleeping. But isolation suited him in ways he couldn't explain to others. The silence allowed him to hear things he had missed during the busy years when customers filled the shop with chatter and laughter. The building itself seemed to breathe around him, wooden beams settling with soft creaks, floorboards responding to changes in temperature and humidity. The dolls, too, had their own subtle sounds. The faint tick of expanding porcelain, the whisper of dust settling on painted surfaces, the almost inaudible shift of fabric as gravity slowly pulled at tiny garments. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as winter was finally releasing its grip on the city, that Sota heard something that didn't belong to the familiar symphony of his workshop, a soft scratching sound like fingernails against paper coming from the direction of the front door. When he looked up from the doll head he had been staring at without really seeing, he noticed a white envelope that had been slipped beneath the door. The envelope was made of heavy paper, the kind that cost more than most people would spend on correspondence. His name was written across the front in handwriting so perfect it looked like calligraphy, each character formed with the precision of someone who had spent years practicing the lost art of beautiful penmanship. The envelope was sealed with red wax, stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize but which seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same heavy stock as the envelope, with just a few lines written in that same perfect hand. The message was simple and direct, yet something about it made Sota's hands tremble as he read it. The words seemed to carry weight beyond their meaning, as if they had been chosen with the same careful precision he once brought to selecting the exact shade of paint for a doll's lips. There was no return address, no signature, nothing to indicate who had sent this mysterious commission. But tucked behind the letter was a small photograph, the kind people used to carry in wallets or keep on bedside tables. It showed a woman smiling faintly at the camera, her expression caught in that moment between happiness and something deeper, more complex. Sota stared at the photograph for a long time, his pulse quickening with each passing second. The face was achingly familiar, yet he couldn't place where he had seen it before. The eyes seemed to look directly at him, holding secrets he felt he should understand. The more he studied, the more convinced the image he became that this was not a stranger, but someone whose features had been etched into his memory so deeply that forgetting them would be like forgetting how to breathe. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Sota found himself standing at his workbench with purpose. His fingers moved with a certainty he hadn't felt in years, selecting tools and materials as if following instructions written in his muscle memory. The clay responded to his touch like it was eager to take shape, and the delicate brushes seemed to guide themselves across the porcelain surface. Each night he would work until his eyes burned from strain, then collapse into bed only to dream of hands that weren't his own continuing the work while he slept. As the passed, the doll began to take on features that made his chest tighten with recognition. The curve of the cheekbones, the slight upturn at the corners of the mouth, the way the painted eyebrows arched just so. It was as if his hands were remembering something his mind refused to acknowledge, drawing from a well of memories so deep he had forgotten it existed. The workshop, which had been silent for so long, began to fill with sounds again, not the cheerful hum of activity it once knew, but something quieter, more intimate. The floorboards would creak at night when he was certain no one was walking on them. The radio, which hadn't been turned on since Aiko's death, would sometimes emit soft static that almost sounded like whispered conversations. Once, he could have sworn he heard someone humming the melody she used to sing while arranging flowers. Sota found himself talking to the emerging doll as he worked, explaining his technique the way he used to when Aiko would sit nearby, asking questions about his process. He would catch himself mid-sentence and realize he had been speaking aloud to an inanimate object, but the habit felt so natural he couldn't bring himself to stop. The doll seemed to listen, its half-formed features patient and attentive. The Photograph Pro remained against his lamp, and he found himself glancing at it constantly. The woman's face had become a map he was learning to navigate, each detail revealing new territories to explore with his brush. The way light caught the hollow beneath her left eye, the tiny mole just above her lip that he somehow knew would be there before he looked closely enough to see it. The expression that seemed to shift depending on the angle of his gaze, sometimes welcoming, sometimes infinitely sad. His neighbors began to notice changes. The old woman who ran the tea door mentioned shop next to others that she sometimes saw lights moving through the dollmaker's workshop late at night, not the steady glow of electric bulbs, but something that flickered like candlelight. The postman reported that mail had been accumulating by the door for weeks, as if Sota no longer bothered to collect it. When concerned friends knocked, they could hear movement inside, but no one ever answered. The truth was that Sota had entered a state of focus so complete that the outside world had become irrelevant. Food was an afterthought. Sleep came only when exhaustion forced it upon him. Days blended into nights in a continuous cycle of creation that felt less like work and more like remembering something he had once known perfectly, but had somehow forgotten. The doll's face was nearly complete now, lacking only the final details that would bring it fully to life. As he prepared the paint for the eyes, Sota realized he had never looked at the photograph to determine their color. Yet his hands moved with certainty, mixing shades of brown and gold with tiny flecks of green that seemed to emerge from the paint itself rather than from any conscious decision on his part. When he finally applied the paint to the porcelain, the effect was startling. The eyes seemed to catch and hold light in a way that porcelain shouldn't be able to manage. They appeared almost wet, as if tears might form at any moment. More unsettling still, they seemed to track his movements as he worked around the doll, maintaining eye contact in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up. That evening, as he stepped back to examine his progress, Sota noticed something that made his blood run cold. The photograph was no longer propped against the lamp where he had left it. Instead, it lay face down on the workbench, as if someone had deliberately turned it over. When he reached out to flip it back, his fingers encountered paper that felt different somehow, rougher than it would have before. The image was the same, but something about it had changed. The woman's expression seemed more urgent now, her eyes holding a plea he couldn't interpret. The background, which he remembered being neutral and unremarkable, now showed hints of a room he recognized. The corner of a wooden shelf, the edge of a window frame, details from his own workshop, as if the photograph had been taken here rather than wherever he had originally assumed it came from. His hands began to shake as he set the photograph aside and returned attention to the doll. The face his that looked back at him was no longer that of a stranger. Every feature, every subtle line and shadow belonged to someone he had loved more than life itself. He had been recreating Aiko without realizing it, his grief-stricken mind refusing to acknowledge what his skilled hands had known all along. The workshop fell into absolute silence, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. Then, so softly he almost missed it, came the sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs leading up from the shop. Slow, deliberate steps that he had heard countless times before, accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric against the banister. Sota stood frozen at his workbench, unable to turn around, unable to breathe. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. In the reflection of the window glass, he could see a figure standing in the doorway behind him, watching him with the same patient attention he had been giving to his work. When he finally found the courage to turn around, the doorway was empty, but the doll on his workbench had changed. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, in exactly the way Aiko used to hold hers when she was thinking. and its lips, which he had painted in a neutral expression, now seemed to curve in the faintest suggestion of a smile. That night, something changed in the rhythm of the workshop. The familiar creaks and sighs of the old building took on a different quality, as if the space itself was adjusting to a new presence. Sota found himself working with an intensity that frightened him, his hands moving across the doll's surface with movements he didn't remember planning. Each brush stroke seemed to complete itself before he decided where it should go. The photograph had moved again. This time it sat propped against a small mirror on the far side of his workbench, positioned so that when he looked up from his work, he would see both the image and its reflection staring back at him. The woman's face seemed clearer now, more defined, as if the paper itself was gaining resolution. He could see details that hadn't been there before. Tiny far echo near her left temple, the way her hair caught light at a particular angle, the slight asymmetry of her smile that made it seem more genuine, more human. As the doll neared completion, Sota began to notice that his dreams had taken on an unusual clarity. He would find himself standing in rooms he recognized but couldn't place, having conversations with people whose faces remained just outside his memory's reach. In these dreams, his hands were always busy, always creating something, but when he tried to look down at his work, his vision would blur, and he would wake with the taste of porcelain dust in his mouth. The weather outside had turned unseasonably warm for early spring, but inside the workshop the temperature seemed to fluctuate without reason. Sometimes he would be working in shirt sleeves, sweat beading on his forehead as he concentrated on delicate details. Other times he would find himself shivering, his breath visible in small puffs as he reached for his tools. The doll itself seemed to retain heat longer than the porcelain should have been able to manage, as if something inside it was generating warmth. His neighbors had begun to express concern more openly. The woman who ran the flower shop across the narrow street mentioned to the postman that she sometimes heard voices coming from the dollmaker's workshop late at night. Not just one voice, but what sounded like a conversation between two people, though she had never seen anyone enter or leave the building except Sota himself. The postman nodded knowingly and mentioned that the mail slot had become difficult to use, as if something was blocking it from the inside. On the 7th night of working on the mysterious commission, Sota experienced something that shook him more than all the previous strange occurrences combined. He had been applying the final touches to the doll's lips, mixing the paint to achieve exactly the right shade of rose, when he became aware that someone was humming behind him. The melody was one he recognized immediately, a lullaby Aiko used to sing when she was content and focused on her own work. He set brush with down his trembling hands and slowly turned around. The workshop was empty, falling shadows exactly where they should, nothing out of place. But the humming continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As he stood frozen, listening, the melody gradually faded until only the familiar sounds of the old building remained. When he turned back to his work, he discovered that the doll's expression had changed once again. The lips he had been painting now curved in a soft smile, and the eyes seemed to hold a warmth that made his chest ache with recognition. He reached out tentatively to touch the porcelain face, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he felt the faintest pulse beneath his fingertips. That night, Sota didn't sleep at all. He sat in his chair beside the workbench, watching the doll in the dim light that filtered through his workshop windows. As the hours passed, he began to notice subtle changes that defied explanation. The position of the hands seemed to shift slightly. The angle of the head appeared to adjust by degrees. The fabric of the tiny kimono he had dressed it in looked as though it was moving with the rhythm of slow, steady breathing. By morning, he had convinced himself that exhaustion was playing tricks with his perception. He had been working too intensely, sleeping too little, eating barely enough to sustain himself. The human mind, he reasoned, was capable of extraordinary self-deception when pushed to its limits. But even as he tried to rationalize what he was experiencing, a part of him recognized that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with his craft. The doll was finished now, complete in every detail he could imagine. Yet he found himself reluctant to contact whoever had commissioned it. The thought of parting with this creation filled him with a sadness so profound it surprised him. He had grown attached to the piece in a way that went far beyond professional pride. It had become a companion during the long, silent hours in his workshop, a presence that made the emptiness of his life feel less overwhelming. 3 days after completing the doll, Sota received another envelope. This one was delivered not by being slipped under his door, but by being placed directly on his workbench while he slept. He discovered it when he came downstairs in the morning, propped against the base of his work lamp where he couldn't possibly miss it. The paper was the same heavy stock as before, the handwriting identical in its perfect formation. The message was brief and somehow final. It simply read, "She is ready now. The moon will be full tomorrow night. Leave her on the workbench and step outside when you hear the temple bell ring 3 times. Do not look back until morning comes." There was no signature, no additional instructions, but somehow Sota understood that this was not a request, but a requirement. The commission was reaching its conclusion, and his role as the craftsman was nearly complete. All that remained was the delivery, though he still had no idea who would be coming to collect his work, or how they would know to find him. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Sota found himself checking and rechecking every detail of the doll's construction, adjusting tiny elements that didn't need adjustment, smoothing fabric that was already perfectly arranged. As evening approached, he lit candles around the workshop, though he couldn't explain why this seemed necessary. The doll sat in the center of his workbench, surrounded by the gentle glow of flickering flames, looking more alive than any creation he had ever produced. That evening, as the temple bell began to toll in the distance, Sota understood that some commissions are not about money or recognition, but about completing something that was left unfinished long ago. The mysterious letter had never been from a stranger at all. It had been from someone who knew exactly what his hands were capable of creating, someone who understood that the deepest artistry comes not from technique alone, but from love that refuses to let go. When the neighbors found the workshop the next morning, they discovered 2 dolls sitting side by side on the workbench. Both were crafted with impossible precision. Both seemed to breathe in the morning light, filtering through the dusty windows. The woman's face was serene, finally at peace. The man's expression held the quiet satisfaction of an artisan who had completed his masterpiece. The workshop remains empty to this day, but sometimes visitors report seeing lights moving behind the windows late at night, and the sound of gentle humming drifting through the walls. The locals say it's just the wind, but those who understand the old ways know better. Some love stories don't end with death. Sometimes they simply find new ways to continue, crafted by hands that remember what the heart refuses to forget. So what do you think happened in that workshop during those final hours? Was Sota's gift truly supernatural, or did grief finally claim a man who had poured his soul into porcelain and paint? I suppose we'll never know for certain,